What would be any possible reason for why humanity should not be told everything there is to know and show deep under the ice of Antarctica? Why?
A retired naval officer walked into a structure beneath the Antarctic ice, and the inside was warm. Not slightly warmer than the surface, not the residual heat of machinery, warm like a room someone had been maintaining. 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside temperature was 40 below zero. The doors were 30 feet thick. They opened with one finger. She has been saying this for years, saying it in interviews, saying it on camera, saying it in testimony after testimony that the mainstream press will not touch. And now, the science is catching up in ways nobody expected. Because what researchers have been finding beneath that ice in just the last 3 years doesn't make it easier to dismiss what she described. It makes it harder. The woman who first broke this story publicly spent decades as an investigative reporter. She has a Peabody Award. She is not a crank. And according to accounts she has collected from multiple independent military sources, what is beneath the Antarctic ice is not a geological anomaly. It's a structure, octagonal, ancient, still functioning. The world's governments know it's there. And this story is far stranger than even that opening suggests. Antarctica is not what most people imagine when they picture it. It isn't just flat white. It is the most extreme place on Earth, colder than Mars at certain altitudes, drier than the Sahara at its core, and almost entirely invisible. 98% of the continent is buried under ice. In places that ice is nearly 3 miles thick. An entire mountain range, longer than the Alps, sits completely submerged beneath it, never seen by human eyes. For most of history, we had no idea what was down there. That changed, slowly, around the mid-2000s. Scientists began developing the technology to look through the ice. Ice-penetrating radar, aerial sensor arrays. Autonomous submarines small enough to thread through subshelf cavities. And what they started finding, methodically, piece by piece, was not what anyone expected. In 2021, a team drilled more than 1,600 feet below the Larsen Ice Shelf, the massive floating sheet of ice attached to the eastern Antarctic peninsula, and broke into a river. An underground river flowing in total darkness, cut off from the surface for thousands of years. They expected empty water. They found life, dense, thriving. Active life, hundreds of tiny crustaceans, swarms of invertebrates darting through the dark in currents nobody could explain. The ecosystem was so unexpected that the lead researcher described it as being the first to enter a hidden world. They weren't the first. This is where the story begins. Picture the Antarctic interior at night, no sound. The wind has dropped for once, and the silence is so total it has a physical weight to it. Above, the aurora australis, the southern lights, ripples green and violet across the sky, bending and folding like something alive. The surface beneath your boots is not flat. It dips and swells in long, shallow curves. The topography of whatever is buried below, pressing upward through miles of compacted ice. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. Your breath freezes before it leaves your face. The ice beneath you is, in places, nearly 3 miles thick, ancient ice, compressed over hundreds of thousands of years into something harder and denser than most people realize. It creaks. Not often, but sometimes, in long, low groans that travel enormous distances through the sheet and arrive at your feet like a message. Nothing should survive here. Nothing should be here at all. And yet, according to testimony that has been on the record since 2018, something is. Howe, the investigative journalist at the center of this story, has spent years collecting accounts from military personnel who claim they were sent to Antarctica for missions that were officially classified as research reconnaissance. The nature of those missions, they say, had nothing to do with research. It had to do with something already there. Something that had been found, reported up the chain of command, and quietly buried. The first detailed account she published involved a retired Navy SEAL who agreed to speak only under the condition of complete anonymity. He described being dispatched to the southeastern coast of Antarctica in August 2003. His orders, he said, were simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back. That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report back." That's it. He said, "We're simple. Locate a specific position, document what was there, report ba return. No further context was given to him or his team before they left. What they found when they arrived put him on record with her and kept him there for years. The data was clear. The implications were anything but. The team had been moving across the surface for hours before the anomaly appeared on their instruments. A magnetic reading that shouldn't exist in ice. Then, a physical feature. A shape rising from the surface, partially exposed, partially submerged. The source described it as octagonal, 8-sided, symmetrical, with a geometry that ice does not naturally produce. It extended roughly 18 feet above the surface. The majority of the structure was below. He described the material as dark, not the bluish-gray of compacted ice, not the brown of exposed rock. Dark, almost glassy, cold to the touch, in the way that a metal surface is cold, radiating, not just passive. The entrance was framed by 2 panels that measured, by his estimate, somewhere between 18 and 30 feet in thickness. When they pushed on them, expecting resistance, both panels swung open without effort. That detail, the ease of it, is what stayed with him. 30-foot stone doors and negative 40-degree cold, and they moved like a cabinet in a kitchen. Inside, the temperature changed within a few steps. The team's instruments registered 68 degrees, 72 by the time they reached the inner corridor. No visible heat source, no mechanical sound, no smell of fuel or machinery, just warmth, steady and even, as if the building itself was producing it. The walls of the corridor were covered in markings. The source described them as hieroglyphic in style, not identical to Egyptian hieroglyphs, but structured in the same way. Repeating symbols, arranged in deliberate horizontal registers, carved at a consistent depth into material that did not appear to be stone or metal, but something else entirely. Something that did not match any building material in the team's experience. Mainstream scientists, when presented with secondhand descriptions of this account, have pushed back hard. Pareidolia. Some argue the human brain pattern matching shapes in natural formations. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, they point out, restricts military activity on the continent. If a Navy team had made a discovery of this magnitude, the argument goes, it couldn't have stayed contained. Too many people would have known. It's a fair objection. It also doesn't explain what the scientific equipment found next, not in testimony, but in peer-reviewed data. In the Wilkes-Land region of East Antarctica, researchers using satellite mapping and ice-penetrating radar flagged an anomaly that had been sitting in the data, largely unexamined for years. A semi-elliptical shape, a strong, unexplained magnetic field clustering around it, nothing on the surface to account for it. The anomaly sat beneath more than a mile of ice, in a position that correlated, roughly, with what several independent sources had described as the location of an anomalous sub-ice formation. Correlation is not confirmation. The researchers were careful to say so, but the shape was there, the magnetic signature was there, and neither one had a clean explanation. There was a long silence in the recording she made with the first source. He had just finished describing the interior corridor. She let it sit for a moment before asking the next question. On the tape, you can hear him breathe, and then you can hear her just barely say, "How long were you inside?" His answer, she has said publicly, was longer than the mission briefing had accounted for. When they emerged, the team's GPS read a time that was inconsistent with their internal clocks. Nobody could agree on how long they'd been in there. That discrepancy appeared in no official record of the mission. The team was debriefed separately. If you wanted to design a tool to investigate what might be beneath Antarctic ice without attracting attention, you'd design something like the ROV they sent in 2022. Or a remotely operated submarine, small, autonomous, equipped with sensors and cameras, capable of threading beneath a floating ice shelf and mapping what no human eye had ever seen. The mission was a climate study. Routine. Publicly announced. The submarine dove beneath the Dotson ice shelf in West Antarctica, traveled more than 600 miles along the glacier's underside, and came back with footage of something nobody had published before. Enormous teardrop-shaped formations. Say, each one up to 1,300 feet long, carved into the underside of the ice, sculpted, organized, each one pointing in the same direction. The team published their findings. The shapes, they concluded, were the result of water movement and the Coriolis effect, the same physics that governs ocean currents. A natural explanation. Accepted, reasonable. Then, the team returned. In January 2024, they sent the same vehicle back beneath the ice for follow-up mapping. The submarine went under and didn't come back. They searched the area. They retraced the mapped route. The vehicle, which had performed perfectly on its first dive, was gone. Lost beneath the ice, with no debris, no signal, no explanation ever publicly released. The team's official statement was brief. Equipment loss in remote environments is an operational risk. The mission would continue with a replacement vehicle. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. But the team wasn't done with what the first dive had captured, because separately, in the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf further south, another team had identified something else, using radar flown from aircraft. Tunnels. Not small ones. Tunnels running beneath the ice at a height of 820 feet. The Eiffel Tower is 987 feet tall. These tunnels were more than 4/5 of that height, running beneath the ice in formations the team could map, but not explain with full confidence. The official conclusion. Meltwater channels, carved by glacial runoff over millennia. The question the data kept raising. Water carves smooth channels. It doesn't carve 800-foot corridors. If you're finding this as difficult to set aside, as the research teams clearly did, a like on this video goes a long way toward keeping this investigation going. There's a detail about Antarctica that almost never makes it into mainstream coverage. It is, by scientific measurement, the lowest gravity point on the surface of the Earth, not by a small margin. The gravitational field beneath Antarctica is measurably weaker than anywhere else on the planet. Scientists have known this for decades. The explanation, long accepted, was that the ice itself was so heavy it had pressed the land beneath it deep into the mantle, the hot, slow-moving layer of rock beneath Earth's crust. Less land beneath you means less gravitational pull. That explanation has now been revised. In December 2025, a team of geophysicists published a new analysis in Scientific Reports using earthquake data, treating seismic waves the way a doctor treats X-rays, letting them illuminate the interior of the planet. What the model showed was not primarily the weight of the ice driving the gravity anomaly. It was something much deeper, slow-moving masses of extremely dense rock, churning through the mantle beneath Antarctica over millions of years, pulling Earth's gravitational field downward from below. In other words, something at the interior of the planet, directly beneath Antarctica, is behaving differently than it does anywhere else on Earth. The researchers are careful to note this has climate implications. These mantle movements correlate with major shifts in Antarctica's ice sheet expansion over geologic time. That's the official framing. The gravity hole, in their view, is a product of deep planetary dynamics. Nothing more. There's no easy way to say this, but that's also precisely the kind of deep, stable, consistent energy source that would be needed to maintain a sealed structure at a constant 70 degrees in the most hostile environment on Earth for a very, very long time. The data doesn't care about our comfort. The testimony she collected didn't stop with the first source. A second military contact, this one identifying as a Marine, not a SEAL, described a separate encounter in a different region of the continent. Same basic structure, dispatched under cover of a research classification, directed to a location, instructed not to document anything independently. What he described was not what the first source had found. He described going down. Not across the surface, but vertically, through a shaft, in a vehicle he described as mechanical, but unlike any standard lift, into a space far below the surface. His estimate, roughly 3 miles below the ice sheet. At that depth, he said, the temperature was warm, not room temperature, genuinely warm, like a summer afternoon. The walls of the space were dark and smooth, and reflected light in a way he found disorienting. He used the word obsidian, the volcanic glass. Not obsidian as in similar to obsidian, but as in the material appeared to be exactly that. Smooth, dark, perfectly worked volcanic glass, covering every surface of a hull that extended further than his lights could reach. This is where the accounts become difficult to assess. There is actual obsidian beneath Antarctica. That is not speculation. Volcanic rock underlies significant portions of the continent, and volcanic activity has been documented beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet. A 2017 survey identified nearly 100 subglacial volcanoes. Some are dormant, some are not. The heat they generate is measurable, real, and one of the factors that accelerates glacial melt from below. Obsidian hauls 3 miles below the ice in a region of active volcanism. There is a world in which that is a geological formation. A deep lava tube, cooled over millennia, preserved beneath a mile of ice and 2 more miles of bedrock. And there is another world in which that explanation does not account for the shape of what was described, or the temperature of what the instruments measured, or the markings on the walls. The same markings, the first source had said, and that he saw in the structure on the surface. "The world deserves to know," she said in one of the most recent recordings available. Not with urgency, with something quieter, something that sounded, more than anything else, like exhaustion. This is where the story splits. One path leads to a conventional explanation. The other leads somewhere far more uncomfortable. Step back from the testimonies for a moment. Step back from the ROV that vanished, and the magnetic anomalies and the gravity hole. And ask a simpler question. Why Antarctica? Of all the places on Earth where a civilization, or something else, might have built, why the most inaccessible continent on the planet? Why the place with no indigenous human population, no ancient written history, no mythology, no folklore? Unless the structures were built before it was inaccessible. There is a geological fact that rarely appears in popular coverage of this subject. Antarctica was not always frozen. 12,000 years ago, well within the time frame of human civilization, significant portions of the continent were ice-free. Some researchers, following geological evidence of rapid crustal displacement, have proposed that a much earlier catastrophe, a pole shift, a flood event, some sudden global reorganization, rapidly buried whatever existed there beneath ice that has not melted since. Charles Hapgood proposed this theory in the 1950s. Albert Einstein wrote a foreword supporting his reasoning. It is not mainstream science. It is also not as easily dismissed as its critics suggest, particularly given what the ice has increasingly been shown to contain. If we follow this evidence to its logical conclusion, carefully without overclaiming, one interpretation emerges. The structures described by multiple independent military sources in different regions of the continent, with consistent physical characteristics, were built by something. That something had access to materials and technologies not present in any civilization we have documented. The structures were built before the ice, or survived its arrival, and they are still, by every account that has reached the surface, producing heat. Some researchers who have engaged with this body of testimony have proposed a framework that draws on ancient cosmology, a pre-Diluvian civilization, possibly the origin of every lost Golden Age myth in every culture on Earth. Plato described Atlantis as existing before a catastrophic flood that ended it in a single day and night. Antarctic coordinates have been mapped against Plato's description by at least 2 independent research groups. The results are not definitive. They are not nothing either. A more radical interpretation, the one she has been most publicly associated with, is non-human origin. Structures that were not built by humans from a period before human civilization existed. Builders who may still, in some capacity, be present. This is the claim that draws the most ridicule. It is also the claim most consistently supported by the physical details in the testimony. The technology required to maintain temperature in that environment, the material composition of the walls, the markings found in multiple separate locations across the continent. Markings that, according to the second source, were not random. That followed an internal grammar, a visual logic, the way a language follows rules even when you don't speak it. He was not a linguist. But he described looking at those walls the way a person looks at a text in an alphabet they don't know, recognizing structure even in the absence of meaning. Of course, there are simpler explanations. A coordinated hoax, sustained across multiple anonymous military sources for decades. Natural geological formations that a traumatized or suggestible mind transforms into something structured. Official science has not found evidence of non-human construction in Antarctica, and official science is what it is. But official science also sent a robot submarine beneath the ice, found something it couldn't fully explain, and came back the next year and lost the submarine. And official science has confirmed that beneath Antarctica's surface, the rules of the physical world work differently than they do anywhere else. Something is down there. The debate is only about what. In January 2025, an iceberg the size of Chicago broke away from the George VI ice shelf off Antarctica's western coast. A research vessel was in the area when it happened. The team on board made a decision: send the ROV down into the newly exposed seafloor, into the space the iceberg had covered for centuries. What they found silenced them: a thriving, complex, layered ecosystem, corals, sponges, enormous sea spiders, octopuses, a species of jellyfish whose oral arms stretched longer than a school bus, life that had never seen sunlight, that had been sealed beneath that ice for hundreds of years, alive and organized, and completely self-sufficient. We didn't expect to find such a beautiful, thriving ecosystem, the expedition director said. The communities we observed have been there for decades, maybe hundreds of years. The point is not that this ecosystem is the same as the structure in the testimony. The point is what it proves about Antarctica as a principle. The continent does not reveal itself. It holds things. It holds them in absolute darkness, in absolute cold, for timescales that dwarf recorded history. And when the ice finally shifts, when a crack forms, when a fragment breaks away, when a machine gets small enough to slide beneath the surface, what's found there is almost never what was expected. She is in her 70s now. She has been reporting on this for longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. The Peabody Award sits somewhere, probably, in an office filled with binders and satellite maps and printed transcripts of conversations with men who agreed to speak only once, only in the dark, only on the condition that she never used their names. She keeps reporting. The accounts keep coming, not fewer over time, but more. Retired officers, former intelligence analysts, researchers who've worked at Antarctic stations and come back with questions they can't answer and can't quite let go of. The pattern in the testimony has remained consistent for more than 2 decades. The details match across sources who have never spoken to each other. The structures, if they exist, are still there. The ice is still there. The gravity hole is still there, pulling the fabric of the planet slightly downward for reasons that 3 miles of ice and the best imaging technology on Earth have only partially explained. Whatever is beneath that continent has been there through the rise and fall of every civilization we know the name of. It was there before the ice came. It is there now. There is something beneath Antarctica. We are only beginning to understand what kind of something. The ice doesn't lie. It only waits. So here is the question the evidence keeps circling back to, and the one that nobody in an official capacity has answered. The Antarctic Treaty, the 1959 international agreement that governs the continent, reserves it exclusively for scientific research. No military installations, no territorial claims, no weapons. It is the only continent on Earth governed this way. Every major world power signed it. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, Australia, Argentina, all of them. In the middle of the Cold War, when those nations agreed on essentially nothing else, no one has ever seriously proposed revising it. No nation has ever withdrawn. Why would the most powerful governments on Earth agree, unanimously, to permanently give up one of the largest land masses on the planet, a continent larger than the United States and Mexico combined, and agree to it within 15 years of the first large-scale modern expeditions to the interior? What did the expeditions find that made the governments decide, together, that this place needed to be off-limits? Or is it possible that the treaty wasn't written to keep nations out of Antarctica, but to keep everything found in Antarctica away from nations? If this video changed how you see what's buried under that ice, share it with someone who's ready to hear it. The testimony is on record. The anomalies are in the data. And somewhere beneath 3 miles of the oldest ice on Earth, at a temperature that shouldn't be possible, something is still keeping the lights on.